All right, so now that we've seen how to actually do a Lorenz curve, I just want to go through some of the basic concepts. Okay, so um, remember we have this line of equality. So on the left-hand side, this Lorenz curve, this country is basically equal. So it's relatively equal. The distance, this A here inside is really small compared to the total, that total triangle, that total half of the box. And so when you're really close to the line of equality, then things are pretty equal. It also means the line is not changing slope a lot. Remember, the changing of the slope means that that when it's flat, it means that group's not getting very much of the income, and when it's steep, it means that group's getting a lot of the income. And so in the second example, A is way bigger. It's way further away from the line of equality, and so the group at the bottom is not getting much a share of the income. One way to notice that is to just draw a line here. Okay, so that's a little over halfway. But if we look at this group, that's all they're getting. So that really flat part, this group, which looks like maybe, roughly 60% of the population or 55% of the population, is probably getting less than 20% of the total. Very small, right? And then after that, the line gets really steep. Okay, so this one is much more unequally distributed, but just for a rough sense, you can look at the slope of the line, or you can just look at how far away from the line of equality is it. So let's look at some countries now. Let's look at some real countries and just to kind of get a visual of different countries. So this is the U.S. This U.S. data shows two different times. So one shows 1974 and the other is 2014. And so notice, so the big thing is now more. I will come back later on and look at some of the reasons why it's getting more unequal. It's interesting. They're not the reasons you might think. And also the time period when this happened is not necessarily the time period you might think this happened. So many people would probably think that things were more equal and they got much more unequal potentially during the financial crisis or more recently. But actually most of this change happened in the 1980s and 1990s. So since 2000, U.S. total inequality has not changed in terms of income, has not changed as drastically as it did back in the 1980s and 1990s. In fact, if you look at the other index, the Gini index, it has changed actually very little over the last 20 years. But it changed a lot from the 1970s to the end of the 1990s. Okay, and we'll talk why this is happening, but it's definitely true. So the U.S. has become more unequal, significantly more unequal than it used to be, and some of the reasons for why this happened may surprise you a little bit. Okay, two other examples of relatively countries that are not very unequal. These are using decile data again. Is Korea, okay, South Korea and Germany. Okay, South Korea and Germany, and we look at them, and they're not very equal because no countries really are. But the inequality is not so pronounced. In fact, both of them are closer to the equality line than the U.S. was, and Germany is much closer. Okay, so we can see the numbers as they go along. You could compare to some of the examples we did earlier, but yeah, we see how this is working. Hopefully, okay. So these are Korea and Germany, and they look somewhat equal. Germany looks quite a bit more equal than Korea. Let's look at a few other examples. These are now, we have less data points, so these are using quintile data. They're using quintile data. And so we have Egypt and India. They're a little bit further away, but still it's not so extreme. You can follow along with them to compare. So you can follow along and compare. So let me change my color here. So you can say, well, okay, so I can see the first 20% got in India got 8% of total income, and in Egypt got 9%, right? And then the next group is the difference between these two. Okay, so it's the difference from 8 to 19 and from 9 to 22. So the next group, in one case, actually, yeah, in one case got 13% of the income, and in India's case only got 11% of the income. So Egypt, at least in the lower groups, are getting a little bigger share. Okay, as we go then from here to here, again we look at the difference between these two numbers. Okay, we look at the difference between those two numbers, and they're going up. So we see there's actually not a huge difference between these two countries, right? And then the top 20% in both countries has more than 40% of the income, a little more than 40% of the income in both countries. So that's again going from 100 to 58. It went from 55. So here it's 45%, and here it's 42%. Okay, and that's the top 20% of people's incomes. So we get the idea. So these, again, the distance is not so big. So what I want to look at now is some countries where the distance is much bigger. Okay, there's the little misleading part is because we are not, some of them, the graphs I was able to get are deciles and some are quintiles. And so they're not, but you can still compare them. So to compare this one, for example, this is Brazil and Chile. You can see both of them, A is really big, okay? Brazil and Chile. And if we want to keep consistent, so this number is for the 80%, then the scale is slightly off, but this is for the 80%. This is the comparable number for the top 20% of people. And remember, in the previous two, this number was in the 40s, and here it's here we're talking it's in the 60s. Okay, so it's much bigger. So this top group, so these are, we can see from this Lorenz curve they're more unequal, and we can see the top 20% get much bigger share, and then the bottom 40%. 10, 20, 30, 40%, even bottom 50%, let's even go to 50%. The bottom 50% get a much smaller share. So the bottom 50% only get 14% of the total income, right? And the top one in here is 64%, and the top 20% here is 61%. Okay, so very unequal compared to the previous cases. Let me go back to the previous case real quick just so you can see the difference. So again, 42 and 45 compared to 60 something. And in those ones, the bottom 50% was getting more than 20% of the income, and in 20 something percent, right, compared to just 14. So big differences, so much more unequal. And you'll find this in general, the countries in Latin America in general are more unequal than the rest of the world. Minus a few examples, South Africa and Namibia being two of those. But in general, the countries in Latin America are more unequal than the rest of the world.